Good afternoon, everyone. I still see we have people joining us, so I will take a moment and introduce myself. But welcome to our special ABC members only focused session on navigating advocacy opportunities in the 119th Congress. People will keep joining on the back end, but I am Leslie Ritter. I am an ABC board member and Vice President of Healthcare Access at the National MS Society. So good to be with you this afternoon. Um, just a little background and a little context setting. So, as many of us on the call know, we are working in a very complex, rapidly shifting political environment and landscape. Um, so from budgetary restraints to the ever evolving healthcare priorities, the stakes for brain health and the brain health community honestly have never been higher. They are so incredibly high right now. And so in times like these, I think the value of ABC is that we are bringing our collective voices together. We know that that is an absolutely essential role of patient advocacy, and we wanted to design this session specifically for patient advocates and those in the patient advocacy community who um, who are so vital in these times to really kind of ensure that there's a role, an area for all of us to come together and learn what we can do during times like these to really shape the future direction of brain health policy. So whether you are an advocacy newbie or you're a seasoned pro and can find your way from the Capitol to Rayburn without any help in the tunnels, we hope that you walk away from this session today with a really strong understanding of the current landscape, additional factors, how they impact science and healthcare policy, practical tools for engaging with legislators, whether that's in DC or at home in the districts, strategies for really crafting those compelling role specific messages, and really new ideas for cross collaboration in the brain health and science space that can amplify the impact. Um, we also want to mention that there was a companion session to this that was held earlier this week that really focused on the academic, scientific, and clinical interdisciplinary community. We know that it's really going to take both of our sides of that working together to drive home messages. We're also essential to really cultivating a good atmosphere and a productive atmosphere for brain health moving forward. So we did want to call out that that session happened earlier this week. Um, I did want to take this opportunity to turn things over to ABC's outstanding legislative consulting firm at CRD Associates. Today's presentation will be led by the Senior Vice President, Meg Riley, who I know many of you are familiar with, and her colleagues. So I will turn it over to them in just a moment. So just a little bit of housekeeping. So we will be leaving time for Q&A at the end of today's session. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we can get to those during the Q&A session. If you don't see the Q&A box or you're having trouble, you can also drop it into the chat. We'll kind of be monitoring both. Um, so thank you again for joining us this afternoon and for all that you and your organizations are doing to advance brain health and neuroscience health. And with that, Meg, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Leslie, and welcome everybody to this afternoon session. As Leslie said, I'm Meg Riley, a Senior Vice President with CRD Associates, and looking forward to walking through the session with you today. I'm here with my colleagues, Nina and Lucas, so I just want to give them a quick opportunity to introduce themselves, and we'll go back and forth as we make our presentation. Nina, go
Hi,
ahead.
everyone. I'm Nina. I'm a Senior Policy Associate. I'm really excited to be joining you all today. Thanks for joining.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucas Coyle, and I am a Policy Associate at CRD Associates, and I'm excited to be sharing how to be an effective advocate with you all.
Great. Thank you both, and let's get started. So we have a couple of goals to accomplish throughout our time this afternoon. We're going to talk about the makeup of Congress and the federal policy landscape, learn about the legislative and appropriations process, which is a refresher, I'm sure, for many of you, but important to discuss in this climate. Talk about how to best communicate with legislators and also get tips on using coalitions like ABC and engaging with the media. At the outset, I just want to share a reminder that ABC is a nonpartisan organization, and likely many of the organizations that you belong to are as well. So Our advocacy is nonpartisan. We engage with legislators from both sides of the aisle and make our case based on facts and illustrative examples, and that's the type of tips we're going to talk about today. So first, let's talk about what's going on here in DC, because that's something we need to know and be familiar with in order to be successful. I'm sure we have advanced advocates on the line today, but probably some beginners as well. And at any rate, it's always helpful to have a refresher. So just a high level look at Congress, the big picture, so to speak. So we have the House and the Senate, and the House has 435 members and 6 non-voting delegates. Members serve 2-year terms, and they represent districts based on population. And because of those 2-year terms, members of the entire House of Representatives are up for election every time there's a federal election. So every 2 years, the entire House is up for election. They're really always running for re-election. And in that way, they're maybe the most accountable to their constituents and to the voters, and that can have an impact on how they develop and determine the policies they're going to support. In the Senate, there are 100 senators, 2 from each state, serving 6-year terms. Elections in the Senate are staggered, so about 1/3 of the Senate will face election in each election cycle. Here's the leadership of Congress, probably faces that are familiar to all of you. In the House, the leadership in the 119th Congress remains the same as it was in the previous Congress, with Speaker Mike Johnson retaining his role, and Hakeem Jeffries remains as minority leader for the Democrats. Republicans control the House, but the margin there is really razor thin. We have had a couple of special elections to add to the Republican side, and we have had 2 vacancies right now for seats in Arizona and Texas that were held by Democratic members of Congress who recently passed away. So we expect to see special elections in those states coming up in the next couple of months. Until those seats are filled, the ratio of Republicans to Democrats in the House is 220 to 213. So it's just about a handful either way, which would determine, who wins on a policy vote on the floor. 218 is the magic number of votes needed to pass legislation on the House floor when all seats are filled and all members are present and voting. In the Senate, the biggest change to congressional leadership is the ascent of John Thune from South Dakota to the majority leader role. He succeeds Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who had been in that position for a historically long time and stepped down at the end of the last Congress. Long-serving Democratic leader Chuck Schumer remains in his leadership position, though he is now a minority leader as the majority of the Senate shifts to the Republicans at the start of this Congress. So in the Senate, Republicans have control by a margin of 53 to 47, with 2 independent senators caucusing with the Democrats. So that counts towards the Democrats' tally. Under Senate rules, though, most legislation requires a 60-vote majority to advance. So the Senate, by nature, for the most part, has to work together across the aisle, make bipartisan deals to advance legislation. So while we know the Republican Party has unified control in Washington, both chambers of Congress, as well as the White House, passing the conservative agenda in Congress is not fully a given because of that thin House majority. The House Republican Conference will have to always stick together on policies, and they are not known to typically do that. And the Senate needs bipartisan cooperation to move legislation forward. So while it seems, everything is unified, Republicans control everything, there will be opportunity for bipartisan work, and we have to be on the lookout for those opportunities. Here's a look at the healthcare, biomedical research, and public health leaders who have taken key positions in the new administration serving under President Trump. Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was confirmed by the Senate to lead the Department of Health and Human Services in February. Since taking office, he has already overseen a fairly massive restructuring as well as reduction in force across the Department of Health and Human Services that has impacted agencies including NIH, FDA, and CDC. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya was confirmed by the Senate more recently and began his tenure as director of NIH last month. He has made clear that he wants to foster a culture of, quote, respect for free speech in science. So he really wants to encourage dissenting perspectives in research. He has also echoed the new HHS secretary in saying that NIH should focus on research to solve the US chronic disease crisis and committed to carrying out the administration's agenda to, quote, make America healthy again. So with respect to chronic disease, patient advocates have opportunity to work with new leaders and draw attention to and create policy for chronic disease. Rounding out the president's health leaders, Dr. Martin Makary has been confirmed to lead the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Mehmet Oz confirmed to lead the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Susan Monterez was nominated recently to lead the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention after the nomination for Dr. Dave Weldon was pulled at the last minute, among indications that there weren't enough votes in the Senate due to his history of vaccine skepticism. So Susan Monterez will have to be considered by the Senate now. And then Dr. Jeanette Nishawat nominated as Surgeon General. So really next, what's been going on in Washington, D.C. since January? I know that unprecedented times is a really cliche and overused term lately. It's been since the last 5 years that it's sort of lost its meaning. But really, what's been happening in DC to eliminate federal funding, restructure or eliminate departments and agencies goes really far beyond other efforts we've seen before. So in that respect, it meets the definition of unprecedented. In the first few months, the Trump administration has taken a number of drastic executive actions that have reverberated across biomedical research, health, patient care, et cetera. So we'll share just a couple of examples that are relevant to health policy, but don't consider this an exhaustive overview of the full policy landscape. So first, I'm sure everyone's familiar, the president established the Department of Government Efficiency and gave them sweeping power to cut federal spending and other programs. So that's been going on across the federal government. Back in January, HHS also issued a communications freeze, which limited hiring, external communications and meetings, and travel for all HHS agencies. When it was announced, this pause was indicated as temporary and that it would end in early February. But right now, we understand it's still in place. So while some formal communications are going out, some meetings have resumed, really staff at these health agencies are not freely permitted to communicate externally. So it makes it hard for advocates to understand the work that's going on in the agencies. The administration has also, and we mentioned this, prioritized a broad reduction in force across the federal workforce. And that really hit home at HHS at the beginning of this month, with a goal of shedding 20,000 jobs across the department through reductions in force, as well as prior departures since the administration took over. And that includes a reduction of 3,500 full-time employees from FDA, 2,400 from CDC, and 1,200 from NIH. Last on this slide was the federal funding freeze announced at the end of January that sought to pause all federal aid, grants, and loans across the federal government. So that would have been a monumental loss of federal funding, and was met with swift legal challenges, and a court established a temporary injunction. But since then, the Department of Government Efficiency, has continued to halt spending in many individual cases. We also know the administration sought recently to cap facilities and administration costs to NIH grants at 15%, which would have had a devastating impact on biomedical research. This too was challenged in court, and a judge established a preliminary injunction protecting universities and institutions, at least for now. As patient advocates, I know many of you understand the importance of an advocate for resources for NIH, but you might be a little less familiar with how critical these F&A costs are to research institutions. They support the infrastructure of laboratories, other research facilities, they fund security, animal care, and many of the other components that aren't research themselves, but are essential for the execution of research. So these are critically important funds for institutions. And then also highlighting one of the first executive orders that the administration issued was to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the federal government, canceling grants and loans, grants and contracts, and terminating DEI associated positions. So I'm going to pass it to Nina to talk a bit about the response.
Great, thanks, Meg. Yes, so now let's turn to the congressional response to the administration's actions. So the actions that Meg shared with you that have been taken so far by the administration have divided Congress pretty solidly along partisan lines. So Democrats have been vocal in their opposition to these actions, while we've seen Republicans have, for the most part, stayed loyal to the president. Very surprisingly, back in January, Tom Cole, chair of the House Committee on Appropriations, who's pictured on the slide here, was quoted as saying the federal funding freeze was a legitimate exercise of power and that appropriations directed by Congress are not law. This was very surprising because Congress, and in particular appropriators, have long been protective of their authority to make federal funding decisions and hold, their constitutional power of the purse. So this quote, which yielded that authority to the administration, was stunning and really raised the question, will Congress exercise their oversight over this administration? So this has been the case with a number of issues, including cabinet nominations. And we've seen that the Republican majority in Congress has been hesitant to challenge the president. Next slide, please. But that said, we have seen a few examples of legislators speaking out when issues hit close to home. So using the F&A cap as an example, members from both sides of the aisle expressed concern about this. So here on the slide, we've highlighted Senate Appropriations Committee Chair Susan Collins' response and House Appropriations Committee Ranking Member Rosa DeLaurel's comments about F&A caps. The difference here, why we're seeing these two comment here, is that the legislators understand that a cap on F&A risks the research done at their institutions, in their states and districts, and ultimately the jobs and economies that this research supports. So the point here, and we'll discuss this a little bit more when we talk about how best to advocate, is that now more than ever, everything in Congress is local. That's an old saying, but it's true. When legislators understand that a policy is going to have a profound negative impact on their own constituents or their voters, they're more likely to get in the way of it. They're more likely to make sure it turns out in the best case for their voters. Also, I want to underscore the third example on this slide of a recent bipartisan action that we saw in the wake of the HHS reorganization. So on April 1st, we saw Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or HELP Committee Chairman Bill Cassidy and Ranking Member Bernie Sanders send a letter to Secretary Kennedy inviting him to testify before the committee. So while Secretary Kennedy hasn't responded to this invitation, this was a really important bipartisan action that we saw take place recently. Ultimately, these examples underscore that in the climate that Meg's described and that I've touched on, we shouldn't be expecting necessarily to see big policy changes or funding bumps for our programs. But it is important to note these small incremental steps, these small congressional wins that are in our favor, and to work to build on these steps by making the most compelling and local case to our legislators that we can possible. Next slide, please.
Great. And in order to be successful in our advocacy, we really have to understand the process. How does a bill become a law? How does appropriations get to the finish line? And we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is a refresher, probably whether you're advanced or a beginner, because we all recognize Bill here from Schoolhouse Rock in our younger days. But I think it's worthwhile just to do a quick rehash of how does legislation move through the congressional process. After being introduced by a member of the House or Senate, it's referred to the relevant committee or committees of jurisdiction where they hold hearings, maybe a markup, maybe pass amendments to the bill, change it up, and then have a committee vote. Then the vote goes to the floor of either the House or Senate. And if it passes there, it's referred to the other chamber for consideration where they can go through the same process. Both chambers have to pass identical bills, or they have to reconcile the differences via a formal conference committee or more informally negotiate a different bill. If there is a negotiated bill, the House and Senate must each pass that bill. And then it goes to the president for his signature to complete the process. Of course, the president also has the opportunity to veto it, and then it bounces back down to the House and Senate, who can override it with a 2/3 majority. There are two main types of legislation. Authorization creates, makes changes, or expands federal policy. Authorization bills can, quote, authorize Congress to direct money to something specific, but no funds, no discretionary funds specifically are allocated or spent through authorization. Authorization bills can have a set time period, so they may expire after 3 or 5 years, and then Congress would have the opportunity to periodically revisit and renew them. And then appropriations legislation is the money legislation. Only through appropriations legislation can Congress dispense discretionary funds to federal departments and agencies. And that process happens annually with the federal fiscal year beginning on October 1st and ending on September 30th. And I will let Lucas talk a little more in detail about the appropriations process.
Thank you, Meg. So this is a diagram that shows the official steps in the appropriations process. So from the release of the president's budget through committee markups and final passage of the bills, the steps in the appropriations process are drawn up, and this is essentially the framework for the process. It's very important to note that it doesn't ever work as precisely as this slide depicts, and each fiscal year there are a lot of deviations from this plan, but this is really how Congress is meant to consider and approve federal funding. So a good example of this is the recent continuing resolution, which is an extension of previous fiscal year funding that we have seen Congress utilize over the past couple of years. So this process is important to know because as advocates, there's certain stages of the process where your voices are best heard. And one of those stages is when members are beginning to accept appropriations requests. This is an important time to let your members know what programs help support patients and what is really important to your organization. Committee markups are also another stage where advocates can be very influential. At this point, they are making changes to proposed bills, and this is really an opportunity to show your support for provision or advocate for any amendments that you want to see reflected. Next slide, please. So what has been going on in terms of appropriations? Well, after being unable to finalize FY25 appropriations for nearly 6 months, on March 14th, Congress passed a long-term continuing resolution to fund the government until September 30th at FY 2024 levels. So overall, this bill included a $6 billion increase in defense spending and reduced non-defense programs by $13 billion. Now, while it keeps discretionary funding for key health agencies and NIH's base budget mostly in line with FY 2024 levels, it does include some cuts like the scheduled decrease in mandatory funding for the 21st Century Cures Innovation Fund, which decreases funding for the Brain Initiative by $81 million. And we also saw a 57% cut to the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, or CDMRP, at the Department of Defense, which provides grant funding to researchers studying diseases and disorders that are mainly prevalent in service members and veterans and also their families. So for FY26, the process has begun and members have opened up their submissions for appropriations requests. And the subcommittees have also begun accepting written testimony to hear the priorities of the different stakeholders. Now, the impact of the recent restructuring at HHS and other agencies on the appropriations process is still a bit unclear, but the Appropriations Committee has suggested that they will consider the appropriations requests under the same structure as previous years. So that essentially just means that organizations can and should still make appropriations requests and make the case for restoring offices and programs that have been eliminated at the administration level. Now, typically, the appropriations process kicks off with the release of the president's budget in February. In recent years, and especially in transition year, the budget can be delayed. So we don't have the president's budget yet, but based on other executive actions, we can anticipate that it will propose steep cuts to federal spending. Now, we may see a skinny budget from the administration sometime this month or next month, which is just a more stripped-down version of a traditional budget. But the appropriations process has still, very much begun in Congress. And the House is expected to advance partisan bills like they did last year, and the Senate is likely to engage in a more bipartisan process as they historically have done. So now I'll pass it off to Meg to discuss budget reconciliation.
Thanks, Lucas. So now we have a very specified process called the budget reconciliation process that you may have heard about in the news, because it really is what congressional Republicans are focusing on for passing a lot of the pieces of their agenda. Budget reconciliation is a unique and limited legislative process. It only requires a simple majority vote in the Senate and is not subject to the filibuster, so it can be expedited. The process is typically used when one party has unified control of the legislative and executive branches, and they really try to create an omnibus bill for all of their particular priorities that are relevant to the process. It allows, under the Congressional Budget Act, for Congress to use the process for legislation that changes spending, revenues, or the federal debt limit. With respect to spending, it can address mandatory spending, so programs that you would think of as entitlements like Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP, but is not used to address discretionary spending. That's considered through appropriations. And the budget reconciliation process is tied to the passage of a budget resolution. So both the House and Senate must first pass a budget resolution and then move on to the next stage. So where we are with that right now is the House and Senate have passed distinct budget resolutions in February with disparate priorities, came back to the drawing board a little bit and negotiated some, and the Senate passed a new budget resolution on April 5th requiring $4 billion in spending cuts, $150 billion in new military spending, and $175 billion for immigration and border priorities. The House then passed the amended Senate budget resolution on April 10th, but they retained their, quote, instructions to require at least 1.5 trillion in spending cuts. So basically, after the budget resolution passes, the two chambers send instructions to their authorizing committee, telling them how to craft legislation to put those priorities actually forward. The budget resolution itself doesn't make any policy changes. It's more of a framework. And then the instructions go down to the committee. So the House retaining this at least 1.5 trillion in spending cuts through their instructions means that they expect their committees to meet that goal. And that's different from what the Senate has put in their resolution, but the House has discussed and has sort of an informal handshake agreement with Senator Thune that the Senate will work towards that goal as well. So this process is likely something that many of your organizations are following, and that's particularly because of the potential deep cuts to Medicaid that could be put forth in the final legislation. So again, note there's no formal legislation yet that would cut Medicaid, but given the savings that committees are expected to find, specifically proposed savings of more than 800 billion on the energy and commerce side, this could have a tremendous impact on state Medicaid programs. So those cuts are expected to be included in the final legislation that the House and Senate will consider. It's unclear what form that legislation would take, as the relevant committees are just now starting to craft the bill, but we're already hearing a lot of voices inside and out of Congress very concerned about the potential cuts to Medicaid. And in fact, a number of House Republicans this morning, a letter was released showing their concern. So there is not unanimity even among House Republicans for these potential cuts, and it's something that patient advocacy groups will be watching closely. So now to the fun part where we talk about how to advocate and give some tips and tricks. First off, I'll say advocacy requires persistence, and that has been never more true than it is now. We're seeing headlines like this one, that Senate offices receive unusually high volume of calls in Trump's first weeks. Usually the news does not report on the volume of calls in the Senate and House offices, but it's just been so active that we are hearing so many people are, calling their legislators and trying to make their voices heard. And then if the call lines are full, imagine how many emails are being sent in when it's much easier to just click a few buttons and write out a few sentences and get something into your legislator's constituent inbox. So a lot of people are advocating right now. So how can you get beyond all the noise? How can you really make your voice heard? We'll give a couple of tips. First of all, I think a lot of you are part of not only ABC, but various patient advocacy organizations that do a lot of work in the background to facilitate your advocacy. So first I'll say, respond to those action alerts that come to your email. And now I just said probably a lot of emails are going into the Senate and the House, but it's really noticeable when there are hundreds or thousands of emails asking for something specific. If there's a big pile and all those constituents want the same thing, that's noticeable. So click make the email. When organizations ask you to take action, you can also usually personalize those emails with your own stories. And we're going to talk a little bit more how to sharpen your story. But with respect to action alerts, those are intentionally broad because they want to attract the highest volume of respondents who will click the button and send the message in. But if you not only do that, but you take the second step to customize, when it gets to your own legislative office and it has local data, facts about constituents, the real life impact of the policy in that legislator's community, that will make a bigger difference than just a form letter. So take action, but also customize. If you're invited to your organization's Capitol Hill Day, whether it be in person or virtual, that's a great opportunity and you should attend if you can. These days are important for awareness and visibility of important issues on the day that they happen, but they also long-term serve as an inroads for you and your colleagues and your friends and family to build new relationships with your congressional offices. So do these meetings, get to know the staff that you meet with, take their business card, follow up by email, start a dialogue with them. You want them to recognize you and remember your story. That way they'll remember you when you reach out again, when you have something to ask. And they'll also remember you if your issue comes across their desk because Congress is considering a bill or an amendment, and they might reach out directly to you. So throughout that follow-up, if you're working with an organization, make sure to keep in touch with the staff there because they can help you. They can help you answer questions that come up and give you advice on your follow-up. The most important thing there is to build and maintain that relationship. In addition to emails and meetings, make the phone call. Don't be discouraged just because the headlines say the phones are ringing off the hook. The fact that they're ringing off the hook is noticeable, and that's making members of Congress kind of turn their heads and consider these issues. And if you don't get through, call again, leave a voicemail, ask for a response. If you have been fortunate enough to make a relationship with a staffer, ask for them directly. You don't have to be in Washington, D.C. to be heard. You can make these phone calls. You can develop these relationships from afar. And speaking of being outside Washington, D.C., we have the congressional calendar here for you up on the slide. All of these white spaces represent times when both the House and Senate are spending time back in their state or district. So how can you take advantage of and leverage those scheduling opportunities? Call the district or state offices and ask for a meeting. See if you can go in and discuss your priority issues with staff during that time, and you may run into the member of Congress. Look for the legislators' public calendars during these times. Are they hosting any town halls? Are they participating in community events? You can show up to those events and share your concerns, share your stories, share what kind of policy you'd like to see happen in Washington. And just a word about public events. Sometimes we see them on the news and they can get a little rowdy and passions are running high right now, but be respectful. Public events with your legislator are an opportunity for that kind of nonpartisan, fact-based advocacy that I noted at the beginning. No matter who your legislator is, if you want to bring them on board with your issue, the way to make them understand the importance of whatever funding or policy piece you're talking about is through persuasive discussion, illustrative examples, and your personal story. Also, throughout all of this, see if you can find common ground with your legislator. Obviously, advocacy is about advancing a particular agenda, but it's also about making smaller steps, having incremental change. And as Nina said, like getting those small steps forward And if you can find a little bit of common ground with your congressman, maybe that's just the first step into creating a champion and developing a long-term supporter for your issue. Over to Lucas.
Thanks, Meg. So in every advocacy situation, your story is the most important tool in your toolbox. So you really want to frame your message and strategy and indicate what you want and why, and really tie your story into that. So it's very important to make it local. Really think, who exactly will this help? And we really emphasize that an effective advocacy strategy combines both the data and also how that connects with personal stories. But the personal stories are what create that emotional connection that really resonates with lawmakers. So why is crafting your story important? Well, sharing your lived experiences will help policymakers see the human impact behind their policy decisions. And a well-told story can also break down complicated topics and make it really much easier for legislators to grasp and also act on them. And as many of you know, there are many complex health conditions, and describing how a condition can be debilitating, or how specific research or a program has improved the burden of a condition, will help legislators understand the issue much better. And also keep in mind that you are the expert on the condition that you are advocating for. So staffers in the members' offices that you meet with may be familiar with the fields, but are most likely less knowledgeable on your specific topic area. So again, a good blueprint to go by is to share how it affects you, your community, or those that you represent. Explain the obstacle or harm caused by current policies or a lack of action, and then clearly state the policy change or support that you're advocating for and how it can make a difference. Next slide, please. So as I touched upon a little, when communicating with your legislators, it's really important to make your case local. Elected officials are accountable to their constituents. And at the end of the day, legislators have to be able to defend their actions to their constituents. And if they can't, then they risk not getting reelected. So it's very important to connect the dots between policy decisions made in DC and also the real world outcomes for people in their districts. So to those with advocacy experience, making a local connection with your advocacy request will sound pretty familiar, but the current landscape is making this even more important. So in the current climate, you may see that members of Congress use their influence with the administration officials a little more quietly. And although they may not make announcements on a particular issue, if it is impacting their district, there have been reports of these legislators holding discussions and working to protect or save programs or economic interests for their constituents back home. So this is all to say that there is a chance that your legislators will more subtly use their contacts to protect local interests. But they need to truly understand what those local interests are, and it's important as advocates to help ensure that they know that. And in a moment, we're going to talk about how to best tell your story during congressional meetings. So here are some questions to consider as you start thinking about making your case. So who will it help in your state and district? And what is the data to demonstrate the impacts to your state or district? And think grant funding loss or job loss. And now I'll hand it over to Nina.
Great, thanks, Lucas. So let's build a little bit more just on how to make your case local when it comes to brain advocacy. So as Lucas shared, it's important to demonstrate during your advocacy how the brain health programs that we're all advocating for translate on the state or district level for constituents. You all represent a diverse number of brain groups, and you are the experts in these meetings, as Lucas said, when it comes to lived experience with a specific brain condition or disease. On this slide, we've just highlighted some examples of state-level brain statistics that can help to bolster your personal story and demonstrate how brain conditions or diseases impact your legislators' constituents. So depending on your advocacy, of course, this will vary between the different groups, but some powerful data to share in your meetings might include the prevalence or incidence rates, mortality rates. If you're advocating around a Medicaid or Medicare policy, you might want to talk about that population in your district or state or the cost for treatment. Again, you're the experts here, so share the data that you know is relevant, you know, is trusted and powerful. Some of your groups collect data on specific brain conditions or diseases, but if you're looking for additional resources, we would recommend looking at trusted sources, such as the CDC, your state health department, fellow patient advocacy groups, and scientific journals, just to name a few. I'll also note, as some of you know well, some brain diseases and conditions are rare and have limited data to share. That's okay. If the data exists, share it. And if it doesn't, maybe that becomes part of your personal story, your advocacy story for why more research and more funding is needed. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So then also many of you advocate for NIH. So let's use that also just briefly. Let's use that as an example to expand on the job and economy angle at the local level. So as many of you know, NIH supports the US economy by driving and sustaining local economies. Based on a 2024 study by a group, United for Medical Research, in 2024, NIH grants generated $95 billion in economic activity in FY24. They supported almost 408,000 jobs nationwide. And each dollar in awards translated to a return on investment of $2.56, which is a really phenomenal return on investment when you think about it. This data, of course, is nationwide, but that study also dives into state level NIH statistics, which are available online. This data demonstrates that not only is NIH the world's premier health research agency driving scientific advances that save lives and improve health, but the NIH is also an economic powerhouse, creating jobs, fueling economic activities in communities across the country, as well as driving innovation that supports American global leadership. So depending on your advocacy, tell your legislators how NIH supports your state or institution. You can reference the data from your district or state, or if you or your colleagues are actually recipients of NIH funding, share how recent actions have impacted your work. I'll also say, these past two slides have focused a lot on concrete numbers or statistics that are specific to your state, but the data really serves to supplement and complement your story. Like Lucas said, the data makes you credible, but your story makes you memorable. So I'd leave you with that. I would focus on your story, focus on making it local, and the data is there just to help you out. Next slide, please. Great. Okay, so putting this all in practice, so meeting with congressional offices. If you're able to secure a meeting, whether in the DC office, the state or district office, or maybe it's virtually on Zoom, we would recommend doing your homework first. So you're likely going to be meeting with a staffer, and a quick search of that staffer will help you find their LinkedIn page and give you a little bit of insight into their areas of specialty and the content, perhaps, of their legislative portfolio. So finding things like their education, what degrees they might have, and any legislation that they might post about will help you give an idea of how familiar they might be with an issue or the background that they're bringing to your meeting. So that said, it's also good to do a quick search of the members' website, which will list their legislative priorities, what legislation they champion, their committee and caucus assignments, a list of their press releases, their social media pages, and how to get in touch with the office. And so what should you expect for the meeting? So typically the meeting is scheduled for anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, although, and some of you may have experience with this, a staffer might start off the meeting by telling you they only have 5 minutes or they only have 10 minutes. And that's okay. That's not them being rude. That's the nature of their busy schedules. So we would encourage you, to ask your staffer at the top of the meeting, how much time do they have you? How much time have they allotted for the meeting? That way, if you have to give them your quick elevator pitch or if you have, a full 15 or 30 minutes to chat with them. I'll also say the tone should be conversational. There's no need to be scared of the staffers. They want to hear from you, their constituents, and it's their job to listen to you and to ask you questions. So to that end, welcome questions. If they ask you something that you can't answer, that's okay. That's honestly the perfect opportunity for follow-up. where you can share those answers. And ultimately, as Meg was saying, that's the perfect opportunity to continue the relationship and to continue being a resource going forward with that office. So when you deliver your ask, keep in mind what Lucas shared about crafting your story and making it local to the state or district. It's good to stay on topic. It's important to stay on message. I'll also just mention that these aren't political meetings, right? This isn't the place to talk about campaigns or financial contributions or say whether you did or did not vote for the member. Those type of political items don't really have a place in these type of meetings. Finally, I'll just say, remember to thank your staffer and send a follow-up email. These 2 steps go a long way to keep that dialogue and relationship going with the office. As I mentioned, a follow-up is not only another opportunity to share your asks with the office and any materials you have, it's also an opportunity to share any items you promised during the meeting. Next slide, please.
Great. Thanks, Nina. And now we will round off with our last section before we get into questions from the audience. Talk a little bit about coalitions. So I know if you're on this webinar, you understand the importance of coalitions because you're a member of the American Brain Coalition, and ABC is the leading coalition bringing together diverse voices and perspectives across the brain health community to advocate for policies that will advance a better understanding of the human brain. Coalitions can be really valuable. Instead of going to a Hill meeting by yourself and sharing one story and one perspective, a coalition can help convene maybe research professionals, clinicians, and patient advocates together to more deeply demonstrate the broad impact of federal funding or policy. So, for example, ABC has really done just that in the past by bringing those voices together to advocate for the Brain Initiative on the Hill, and that's an important, valuable tool that ABC can offer its members. There are a lot of coalitions in the advocacy space, and each has their own goals and objectives. I imagine a lot of the organizations that you all are part of are members of a number of different coalitions and work within them in different ways to advance different policies. So no single coalition exists to advance every item in each of their members' agenda, but they're formed to bring these voices together to really press on a specific goal. And coalition work is two-sided. I think most importantly, you or your organization will get a lot out of the coalition. It brings value and strengthens and amplifies your work. But you also can add value to the coalition that helps your organization and others by offering yourself and your organization as an expert, providing resources, and importantly, probably most importantly, volunteering when opportunities come up, like meetings and letters and other opportunities to work together, because the strength of a coalition really is the combined strength of its membership. And last, we will talk a little bit about leveraging the media, traditional media, and also social media. So starting with the old-fashioned stuff, you can still engage traditional media, online and print sources. For example, one way to do that is through letters to the editor. So you read your local papers, your legislators read those local papers. They want to see what their constituents are saying, how they're reacting to the news, how they're reacting to policies. So a letter to the editor is an opportunity to write in. It's usually tied to a piece of news that had previously appeared in the publication. So be scanning for those. Look for your issue to come up in the news. And then write a short letter to the editor that shares your perspective on that story and on that issue and how it is relevant to the local community and local economy. Letters to the editor are pretty short. Each publication will have guidelines, so you can look those up and make sure you follow them when you make a submission, otherwise it won't be placed. And include your contact information. The publication may have to reach out to you for confirmation before placing it in the paper, but that option is always there for you as issues that you're concerned about come up in the news. Writing an op-ed is another option, a little bit of a heavier lift and a bigger piece of writing. These are opinion columns, maybe around 750 to 800 words, but it gives you more space to write out a clearly persuasive argument. Your op-ed should have a point of view, but it should be backed up by facts and data, illustrative examples, maybe quotes, and some of your background research. The process to have an op-ed published is also going to be a little more challenging than submitting a letter to the editor. On this, I would really encourage you to work with the organization or institution that you either work with or volunteer with. If they have a media department, you can work with them for guidance and assistance. Getting an op-ed in a paper might require pitching to that paper's editorial staff, so that might be something that a media professional can help you out with. And then the last thing is just having relationships and a dialogue with traditional media and reporters. This, again, is something you'll want to work with your organizations with. Their media department are constantly talking with health reporters, with policy reporters. They build relationships. Be in touch with that staff. Share articles that you've seen, share the expertise that you have. Maybe they can look to you as a spokesperson or an expert to provide a quote, or maybe they can highlight some of the work you're doing as they pitch stories or as they read the news and think about opportunities for reporters to do follow-up stories. So, Lucas.
I'll try to be brief here so we save time for questions. But we have truly seen the power of social media and policy in recent times. And the fact of the matter is, the more people support an issue, the more eyes it will get. And social media can be used in a variety of different ways, engaging people at your local community, engaging with your peers in an institution or field, and even members of Congress to support a policy or advocate against it. And there's quite a few platforms that can be leveraged now. I think we know them all, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc. So some examples of good social media practices or tagging members, a member office that you met with on LinkedIn, and sometimes even the staffers in these offices will even ask you to do so. Another example is just posting about relevant news and highlighting its impacts, or even circulating a community letter to Congress. Also, making short videos or infographics on patient stories and experiences. Lawmakers really do appreciate something that's visual and easily digestible, and oftentimes a video format is just much more convincing. Some tips and tricks for getting started on social media if you haven't already. Follow your elected officials, be active and be up to date with them. However, you really want to make sure that your engagement is respectful, professional, and not antagonistic. And also, you want to keep your messaging short. Social media does have a pretty short attention span, and it's important to be very concise. Use photos and visuals whenever you can, and tying it back to making it local. Make it clear that you are a constituent, and it's something that impacts you or the people that you represent. Next slide.
Thanks, Lucas. And I guess we had a lot to say, so we do only have a few minutes for questions, but we are happy to take those questions. And then if you don't get a chance to ask yours, we can also follow up.
Thanks, Meg. And again, please put your questions in the chat. We have a couple. And again, as Meg said, if we don't get to them all, we'll have a list and can share them with everyone who registered today and is online. So no worries about the time. So Meg, I do want to touch on a couple that I think would be helpful. Just, hopefully these are very quick. But one thing that came through, can you kind of differentiate the timeline between budget reconciliation and appropriations, just to kind of help people differentiate what are the timelines between the two there?
I hope I can, but I don't, as we kind of tried to make clear, everything, all the processes that are laid out aren't always the way things actually go. I'll start with appropriations, which does have a pretty defined annual timeline. As Lucas mentioned, typically the president's budget comes out first in February, but the committees are able to just begin their work with or without that budget. So they start in the spring by collecting requests, testimony from outside stakeholders, as well as priorities from members of Congress. Later in the summer, they will have written bills and hold committee markups prior likely to the August recess. September is typically a timeline where we might see appropriations bills on the floor, at least of the House, potentially on the Senate. And then the fiscal year ends September 30th, and any time after that, we might have a CR, and anytime after that, we might be needing to review and renew and try and get appropriations across the finish line either before or after the end of the calendar year. Budget reconciliation doesn't have the same sort of typical schedule, but it does, again, have to start with the passage of that budget resolution. So whenever the House or Senate House and Senate, are able to pass that budget resolution, which they've just done, then the committees begin to build the bills. And the majority wants to move this process as fast as they can. So the timeline that's being discussed right now is to produce a bill in the coming weeks and, vote on it in May. Is that realistic? I personally don't think so, but we'll have to see. There's no deadline with budget reconciliation, except to say that it does have to be tied to the fiscal year's budget resolution. So they have limited ability to make additional attempts.
No, thank you. That's super helpful. I can see how the timelines would be confusing for people, especially when you're hearing things in the news and fiscal years are a little off. So this is
Yeah.
super helpful. Um, I think the other question kind of goes back to the theme of everything is local nowadays. So what is some tips that you can share for framing messages in a way that resonates with the legislators that we're meeting with, whether they are, sometimes you'll have 3 or 4 meetings and they'll be with different members of different parties. So how can you really tailor that messaging so it resonates across the political spectrum?
Yeah. One thing we're hearing from congressional offices right now is they want to hear these, I'll call them impact stories. They want to know whatever given thing you're talking about, whether you're for or against it, how it impacts their constituency or their state. So if for instance, that a grant has been eliminated at CDC, and that means your state lost a certain amount of money to work on mental health, for example. That's an important impact story. That amount of money, whether there were people working in the state health department who were federally funded and they've lost their jobs, that's important too. I mean, these legislators know that federal funding often keeps their states up and running. Like a lot of state health departments are not just funded by the state. And so they need to know, is this going to impact the health of their communities? And so those funding numbers, job numbers, those types of things are really helpful.
Thank you for that. And I think the last one really kind of that we'll have time to get to today, but we will follow up with others. How can we better position brain-related conditions as a national public health priority, given that there's so much noise out there? How can we really drive home the need for support and funding for brain health?
I think that's a great question. And I like to look to the Brain Initiative as the exemplary thing to talk about with that respect. The Brain Initiative has been so groundbreaking over the past 10 or so years. And we have the researchers involved have made these fascinating discoveries, but they're only just starting. And some of these examples that we can show from the Brain Initiative, draft maps of fruit fly or mouse brains, and they're working on mapping the neurons in a human brain. If we were to stop that progress, that not only stops our progress towards understanding brain diseases, looking for treatments and cures, but the technologies that the Brain Initiative is developing that are going to change research for the better across the board. I think understanding what could be lost without continuing that research is really important and positions what we're doing in brain health as really preeminent.
Thank you for that. And I know we are right on time, so we've reached the end of our session. Thank you to Meg, to Lucas, to Nina. Thank you for so much for offering your insights today and such a great and comprehensive presentation. So, as everyone on the line knows, the ABC is dedicated to supporting your advocacy efforts. So, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions, need additional resources, need to be connected, have just very simple procedural questions. We're here to kind of meet your needs and the needs of the brain community. So please don't hesitate to reach out. This session has been recorded and will be shared. We do recommend and want you to share this with your colleagues. And if you're watching this on demand and you have questions, please feel free to reach out. This is not a one-time thing. We're happy to kind of reach out at any point in time to kind of answer questions as they come in. Thank you again to everyone who has attended. Your voice is powerful, your story is powerful, and we know that you are the kind of groundwork that we need to build those champions for brain health on the Hill. So, your expertise and advocacy are really what drive the ABC to be as powerful as it is the voice of the brain health on Capitol Hill, and now is more important than ever. So keep up the incredible work. We look forward to seeing you in the halls of Congress and on calls, and we look forward to partnering with you throughout the years. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time.